So we've come to this place this morning to consider individually and collectively how to be more receptive to deepening our availability to friendship. And I'll include family relationships in there too. Our theme this month is invitation. And so how do we invite people to being in friendship with us? In the quote I just read from author and poet Mark Nepo, he's explaining that belief that the deep love in friendship is so sure, whereas hope can be fleeting if it's tethered to things that aren't relational, if it's tethered to things that are external. So where he's leading us is that hope can always be present within a deep friendship. Actually, it sort of cooks it up, rather than from external sources. Therefore, it can be a constant. Friendship also bears witness to the parts of us that we don't see ourselves. It finds strength in us where we might not know we had it. When you get that comment from someone where you go, whoa, I didn't know that that was what I was projecting in the world. Didn't even know I could create that in myself. Nepo is inspired by a 16th century friendship. It's a remarkable friendship because it's between famous artists. It's between Michelangelo and Vittoria Colonna. And this is the friendship that kind of got him thinking about holding the hope. So Vittoria Colonna is from an ancient and noble family that had both power and wealth. Vittoria was highly educated and became a leading female poet of her time. She wrote about her love for her husband and much about the adoration of God. She eventually published a small book of love sonnets titled Amorous Rhymes. 16th century, she titled it Amorous Rhymes. Some of her correspondence and poetry is preserved in the Vatican. While she was still young, although married, her parents died and then her brother. And eventually her husband died of wounds in battle. After her husband's death, she wanted to just withdraw from society, and she tried to join several convents. But the Pope, who knew her parents well, stopped her from doing so. So Vittoria stayed in her silent place for a while. But her family had been very connected to society, including many famous artists, and she began going to receptions. That is where she eventually met Michelangelo through another artist she knew. I'm forgetting who it was, but it was one of those famous in that time in Italy. So when they met, he was 61 and she was 46 at that time because she'd been kind of away from society and then reblooming into it. Over the next 10 years, they spent long hours together. They also had voluminous correspondence, writing each other every day, sometimes when they were still in the same city. Their initial correspondence, much of which has been preserved, shows their relationship to be polite and learned, and then it matured and deepened over time. Eventually, Vittoria wrote a manuscript of spiritual poems for him, and he was at her bed when she died, sitting beside her. Nepo gives the example of their friendship as a relationship that brought out the best in both parties and who deepened their experiences. It also spoke of the difference between lasting friendship and fleeting hope. Their hope was anchored inside their relational friendship. He was especially impacted by one of the lines from her poems, and he includes it in his book. If I am not now granted a great reward, it is not because God is ungenerous or insincere, but because I fail to understand completely that all human hope is as fragile as glass. Their story is also a reminder of how to be available when moments of beginning or deepening friendships appear. Victoria had been so distressed over the loss of her husband that she had sought life in a convent. And when she couldn't, she eventually took that risk to return to life with others. She allowed herself to invite in this friendship with Michelangelo. Their relationship deepened to the point that he was invited to her deathbed when she was dying. And his offer in that moment was to be steadfast. Now, while this is a story between creative geniuses, we might be out there thinking, it's not exactly my life. But let us be reminded that deep friendships come into our lives often in really ordinary ways. Commuting to work on the same bus or train. I commuted the ferry for 25 years, and I definitely made friends there. Attending the same book group, maybe again and again. Taking some Ollie courses. Working shoulder to shoulder on a volunteer project like Fork and Spoon or Habitat for Humanity. For me, it's my Friday Painters group. That group started with only one UU, which is not how I got in it. I actually got in it when someone at the senior center said, "You're too young for our group here, you should go paint with these other people." And I was new to Bozeman, and it was such a thrilling thing for them to let me into this group and for me to start sharing my story, and friendships developed. So when a friendship is developing slowly and over time, Nepo says the ordinary crosses over into the extraordinary. We, day by day, experience by experience, find the friend that waits in every stranger. Once we sit together, perhaps we offer some tangible assistance, or maybe it feels less tangible, like deep listening, and a deep bond of humanity is revealed. The capacity already lies within us, and the tricky part is just getting stuff out of your way. For those of you who are new, you don't know that I have been gone all summer. I was the minister here last year, and then I went back to Washington for July and August and part of September, and Washington is my home for decades. But I ran into someone at the co-op this week who I know through the Bozeman Tenants United, and I said to him as he was sitting and working, I took this risk and I said, I have missed you so much, and I think about you all the time. He reminds me, he and my son are two peas in a pod, which I think is why his face and the things I've heard him say and his life come to me so often. But I took this risk and I shared that with him. And he said to me, and I said, "You're one of my favorite people that I met in Bozeman." And I meant outside the congregation, of course, of course. And he said to me, "You are too." I'm still processing all of that, and I'll definitely have coffee with him when I come back. But what if I hadn't taken the risk to tell him that in person? That moment of beauty would not have been exchanged between us. So while we first look, deep friendships might be formed by compassion that evolves from shared experiences. And I can say, in my case, it was the shared experience of being part of BTU and doing that work together. But there are times when we all have compassion for those we might first think, I don't think I have much in common with them. But Nepo shares his own stories of his cancer diagnosis and treatment. And in my own journey through the years, he says, I have tried to meet, sit, and listen at every turn. He loves meeting complete strangers in cafes. That's part of his thing. He says, like every generation, we solely need to endure and learn from our differences while building on our common fundamental ways. And as only a poet can say, like all souls thrown ashore, we have to suffer loss and accept the fierce fragility of life. Like all friends, we have to mirror and affirm our experience of being worn down to only what is essential. And though every bond is not always known, every bond matters. As we were listening for the story of all ages this morning, I was identifying in the story not only the horrific racial discrimination, but I was identifying her strength points, her friendships, her touchstones, because that was a hard journey. But she knew the person selling pretzels who took time to speak to her, and she knew the doorman. I hope next time she goes on the journey to the library, if Grandma can't go, I hope she can bring a friend. I also hope that more white people came to ask her, how did you get the courage to make that trip when there is so much hostility coming your way? I also hope that white people white people who didn't share the same experience, but they could support in word and in deed, and just by being curious about her experience. Because she made another friend, someone else she could go to, the flower woman. So it was about 2 months back that I was reading Mark Nepo's book, You Don't Have to Do It Alone, The Power of Friendship. I was really reading it for my own enlightenment and pleasure and spiritual growth, and I had just returned after being really away from my community and my friends for 2 years, and I was thinking about how do we get back into those friendships face to face. So I was really thinking about my own life. And then I received the news of Janet Lewis in stage 4 cancer. And for those of you who are new this morning, Janet Lewis is a member of was a member of our congregation. And then her death shortly thereafter. And then the death of Bob Williams. So then the messages in his book started to feel like a message we all needed to hear. So, and if you're newer to the fellowship and you didn't know Bob and you didn't know Janet, you can think about someone in your own life, in your own history, who's died. When those friendships are forever changed by death, we experience at a primal level, if we allow ourselves to, we experience what did we learn about ourselves in those friendships? What were the enduring elements that we get to carry with us? Those are treasures. Our friendships, whether our friends leave the earth before us or not, are the things that hold humanity together. Those friendships bring out the best in us and our deepest capacity for empathy and care. Friendships where we risk showing who we really are and trust that the other person is going to accept our ragged, imperfect, come-as-you-are being. Perfection never required. Friendships is where you are explorers together. You're taking risks together. Author Florida Scott Maxwell says, be fierce in that deepening of a friendship. Because through showing who you really are and your love and care for another, she says, quote, you need only claim the events of your life to make yourself yours. When you truly possess all that you have been and done, you are fierce with reality, unquote. So she says, it's like show up in those friendships with that fierceness. Don't be afraid to be who you really are. Instead of trying to figure out who you think that other person wants you to be so they'll be interested in you. That is so complicated. Just be who you really are. And we take a risk of becoming more vulnerable and more alive. The other thing that true friendship requires is allowing the other person room to grow. They'll not always be the person you first met. People don't stay the same. Don't let this scare you, because it is scary. It gets scary when you confuse consistency with reliability, the steadfastness. People can change and still be reliable. So they might be less consistent, but they're still steadfast. I remember when I first told my family and my extended family that I wanted to go to seminary and become a Unitarian Universalist minister. Keep in mind, I have a whole ton of atheists over here. They knew me that I went to the Unitarian Universalist church and that I had for a few decades. But my profession, darn it, was a social worker. But no longer. So I was moving on to other things, to deeper things, a deeper discovery of myself and an expansion. But I was steadfast in my commitments to my immediate and extended family. And then they also got to share in a few of my deeper discoveries, the ones that didn't feel too scary for them. Another concept that Nepo writes about is called netting, and it's part of this friendship, and it doesn't require that you have a lot of knowledge about the other person. We know a little about netting from our interdependent web, but this morning I am just talking about humans and pets supporting one another. I'm not talking about the whole planet because I just don't have time. But Nepo describes his own cancer and his chemo treatments. And he said, he was in his hospital room, and sometimes his friend came and just sat there, brought the newspaper, read the newspaper, saying very little. This was his friend, Paul. And a few years later, Paul's wife died from a heart attack. And now Nepo sits with his friend, saying very little, bringing the newspaper, but not necessarily reading it. He also attends a weekly men's group, and they supported him as he supported his friend. And he tells us, this is how it works. I almost die, and someone comes to my side, but it's very hard on him to be there. And so he has a friend at his side. And next month or year, it might be you who falls in to the crater. Then I'm there for you, and my old friend is there for me as I am there for you. And this is how the whole net distributes its weight. How the net distributes the suffering and holds the hearts. He says, even our dog climbing on my wife's lap when she is sad is part of that net. End of quote. So sometimes we're in the center of the net, and give yourself permission to be there when you need to be there. Sometimes we have to leave our day-to-day routines to take our place for caring for those in need. But we also have to tune our ears to be hearing for those who are in need. And the net works the same for joy and beauty and wonder and celebration. Also the day-to-day, the boredom, the day where you were hoping for the long walk, but it's now a short walk because it's really rainy and cold. It's just life. And paradoxically, mundane, heroic, and eventually extraordinary. So over the next days and weeks, I invite you to think about your friendships. Think about how you met your oldest friend. How did you realize you were becoming good friends? What were those different layers that your friendship went through? What experience did you share that knit together and fortified that bond? I will leave us with Nepo's words as we ponder our friendships this week. He says, to friends I know deeply, and those I've yet to meet, I make this vow. So maybe you can make a vow this week. Wherever the river of life sweeps you, I will wait. When you need me the most, I will be there to place my hand on your heart and listen. And if all of that should fail, I will love you as you are. Even then, we will hold each other until we rest in the small blue flame in the center of our being that we finally show to one another. Being this exposed, we will walk back into our lives, knowing that the tether that keeps the world from falling apart is the golden thread of friendship that we keep weaving between us.